Vicki Anstey, and I have my daughter Melissa Mulder sitting right here, and my granddaughter Caroline Mulder, and she's 4 years old. And then my dad, Jim Breeden. So we have 4 generations here. My dad's mother was Ruth Littlefield, so related to Moses Littlefield here. So Caroline would be Moses' great, 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 great granddaughter. So we're excited to be here. I'm from Cumberland, which is about 4.5 hours from here. It's in Cass County, southwest Iowa, south of Atlantic, if you know where Atlantic is. So we're very glad to be here and excited to see this program today.
Great, thank you so much. Wow, that was wonderful. We sure welcome all them. And now we'll turn the time over to Don Wentworth for our program.
Can you see past me?
Yes.
Good afternoon. As you can see, we're talking about Moses today. And contrary to popular belief, I did not know Moses personally. Just a little preface. When this whole thing started about a month ago, it set off a firestorm of interest and activity that most people wouldn't be able to understand. And we still have some big questions about this, but we are very tickled to have members of the Littlefield family here, especially Jim, who remembers the stone. Carol Merrill? Carol Merrill.
Oh, excuse me.
So this is the thing that started it all.
This is the grand unveiling. Ta-da!
And this stone was placed in the Littlefield Farm Cemetery in 1878. And Jim remembers as a boy this, am I right, Jim? You remember this in the, where it was originally put on the farm when he was growing, his uncle owned the farm, so. And after a while, we're going to do a photo op with the family around it, but we're not going to put Jim under it. Just okay? We're not going to do that. So a lot of people to thank. This is just a general thank you for just this program. So we thank the Jackson County Historical Society, Jackson County Genealogical Chapter, and the Bellevue Public Library. And as I forgot my remote, I'll be leaning over and pressing a button every now and then. So, as usual with these things, it all started with a phone call. On April 6th, 2023. By now you'd think I would know better than to answer my cell phone. But I answered it. And this time it turned out to be a very nice woman by the name and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Elodie Opstad. She's a special columnist at the Record Herald in Indianola. She has a column called Past Times. So once a month she takes a story from the past, of Indianola's past, Warren County's past, and features it, kind of fleshes it out, maybe tells some things that people don't know. Excuse me. And during our phone call, she related that a nice couple by the name of Ross and Dixie McConnell had purchased a house. It happens to be this house. They purchased it at an online auction through a sheriff's sale. The lady, I think, went to a nursing home, and the house was sold as is, which means she was a hoarder, you clean it out. So that's what they did. The couple, was a young couple, and of course to me a young couple is anything under the age of 35, but they got to cleaning it out, and the very last thing in the garage, in the back corner, there was something. And they moved it, and this is what they found. And you can see that's Ross and Dixie McConnell with the stone, and the picture of the stone. And they didn't know what to do with it. Now, being as they had a dumpster, and they were young and strong and had a project going on, they could have just as easily broken the stone up, thrown it in a dumpster, and that would have been the end of it. But luckily, they called Elodie to come look at it. And Elodie spent 3 to 4 hours on the internet looking for Moses Littlefields. Now, how many Moses Littlefields could there possibly be? She came up with 128 possibilities.
Wow.
And that was narrowed down from 132,000 possibilities over the course of the entire history of the world. So, the only one in her search that matched the death date was the one listed in Andrews Cemetery. And that's this marker. This is a concrete cast marker. It's very ornate and very popular on the turn of the century. And it was put up in Andrew as a memorial stone for the burials, at least some of them that were on the Littlefield farm. As you can see, they're listed right there. And so she called the Jackson County Courthouse, and their standard response today to anybody asking a question seems to be, you need to call Donnie Wentworth. I'm changing my phone number, by the way. So right away, this caused an explosion of questions in my mind. And the first one was, how did a Jackson County gravestone migrate to Indianola, Iowa? Right there. There's us. There's Indianola. How did it migrate to Indianola, Iowa, which is like 214 miles away and takes 3 hours by car? I don't think it crawled. The next question was, how do we get it back here? So I began talking to people nonstop, and talked to a lot of the county's movers and shakers, which we have 2 in this room at least right now. So the first person I talked to was the first mover and shaker. And anybody that is around the museum enough knows how much she can move and shake when she wants something. But she does it in a good way. So I talked to her, and then I started making other phone calls. Lots of other phone calls. And by the end of the day, I had formulated 3 different plans to retrieve the tombstone. 2 days later, I had 7 plans. Excuse me. Multiple people offered to go and get the marker, and for the next 2 weeks, I waited for one of these plans, just one of them, to gel and come together so we knew what was going on. And nothing really happened until late one Sunday afternoon. Gentleman in the back of the room, wave Buck, called me and said, I just passed Cedar Rapids, I've got the tombstone in my truck, where do you want it? So, as you can imagine, so, again, you get a better look at the man of the hour. So I immediately called Bonnie again and said, you know, can you talk to Buck and you guys can arrange, because I didn't know how everything was going to end up. But the problem was that Bonnie was partying again. And she was birthday partying with two grandsons. So she dropped everything, she grabbed her son, because when she talked to Buck, Buck said, "I'm coming, I'm only 15 minutes away," which is a big difference between just through Cedar Rapids and 15 minutes away. Well, I know being an elected official, the laws don't apply to me. But anyway, she grabbed her son and got over here, and they got it all in what they did. They got it up to the lobby, which some of you saw last week, and it immediately caused a great deal of interest. And tombstones are like the pioneers. People think they go someplace, they put down roots, and they stay there forever. Well, they don't. So seeing a tombstone upstairs was kind of a novelty. But then the question was, what do we do with it? And for those of you that are wondering, who was Moses Field anyway? Why are we making such a fuss? When Elodie first said the name Littlefield, I knew exactly who she was talking about. I knew his significance and his family's significance to the history of the county. So, Moses Littlefield was born September 14th, 1789 in Milford, Massachusetts, to Isaac and Elizabeth Lovering Littlefield. He was the fifth of 6 children born to them. And he initially took up shoemaking as a young man, and we know that he was a very skillful violinist. Now, on June 20th, 1814, during the War of 1812, at the age of 23, he enlisted as a drummer in Edwards Regiment Artillery, the Massachusetts Militia. His enlistment continued until October 29th of that same year. Just for reference, the War of 1812 occurred between June 18th of 1812 and February 17th of 1815. And he enlisted approximately 2 months before a very famous incident, which is the burning of the White House by British troops. After the war was over, it is known that he taught violin in Boston to some very elite families there. His clients were not run-of-the-mill ordinary people. They were rich. So that tells you how much talent he had at playing the violin. At the age of 28, he married Mercy Nelson at Middlefield, Massachusetts. And about 3 years and 6 months later, their only child, Samuel W., was born. Isaac and Elizabeth both passed away in 1821. That's just a representative picture, by the way. And they were both born just before Samuel's birth, so they never got to actually meet their grandson. And then Moses, after entering land from the government, brought his family, probably in the spring, to the newly established territory of Iowa in 1839. That's about 6 years after the area was officially opened to white settlers on June 1st, 1833. And after that, something happened, so I'm interrupting you. Oh, so this was after the Black Hawk War. So what the Black Hawk War opened up in Iowa is this right here. And there's Maquoketa. That area is roughly 6 million acres that was opened up for non-Native American settlement. And it was just a couple of years after this fine gentleman, Colonel Thomas Cox, conducted the official survey and laid out the county in 1836. At that time, the country was very sparsely inhabited by whites and was very wild and untamed to our standards. To the Native American standards, it was just fine, but to our standards, that's what we thought. There were likely only 40 to 50 Americans then settled in Iowa, and had settled here prior to the 1833 date. Many of them were traders, trappers, and such, and some came to mine. There was a lot of lead and coal in the area, and they were mining that prior to 1833. By the 1836 census, which was the first census taken in what is now Iowa, there were just 10,500 white inhabitants at that time. So in all this area, there are only 10,500 people. Now, a little perspective, that's about half of the current total population of Jackson County alone, which is approximately 20,000 people. So you can see how sparsely settled it was by non-Native Americans. So this is an image of the Cox survey of the Littlefield Farm area in 1836. And this is interesting for a couple of reasons. These things are villages. They're Native American villages. These are trails of Native Americans they used to use. And the Littlefield farm is right up in here. So they chose the land well. It was well timbered, well watered, and it had enough room to start planting crops. About 6 years, and it was opened about 6 years from when the area was first opened up to white settlers, and this is a representation of settlers coming over. Settlers that were here at the end of the Black Hawk War had to get out, and they had to stay out until midnight on June 1st, 1833. So they amassed on the other side of the river and started taking ferries. The ferries actually launched before midnight so that the settlers could get here as close to midnight as possible. Because if you had a cabin or a barn or a settlement of any kind, if you got there and there was somebody else already in it, you were out. So they had to get back to their property if they had any before somebody took it over. And that's a whole other story. But and it was only about 5 years since this gentleman, Alex Reed, turned the first furrow that had been turned in the county by a white man. The Native Americans, of course, have been growing crops for a long while by this time. And also, at this time, this is what Chicago looked like.
Whoa.
So you can tell it was a long, long time ago. Barb may remember this, but nobody else would. But Chicago was just, it was little more than a trading outpost sunk in the swamps at the time that Moses Littlefield brought his family here. So things have changed quite a lot since then. And so Bellevue in 1833 looked like that. Just a few little cabins right along the river, and you can see the ferry, and then this is the Illinois side. And at this time in Jackson County, this was considered to be a major population center. So the Littlefield farm, as I indicated, M. Littlefield, and that's where the house was. And this is where the Poor farm is. So you can see they share a border. That, in case you're wondering, is the insane asylum. Actually, it's the building that predated the insane asylum that was more or less a barn that people lived in. So that's where it was located, just north of the Poor farm, and assisted by his son Samuel W. Moses cleared land, broke the soil, and Samuel also assisted his father in establishing and creating a homestead. Now, in 1854, Moses received 40 acres. So they called it 40 acres. It was 39.9 acres of land from the government for his service in the War of 1812. And I don't know if he got to pick this or whatever, but it joined right nicely in with the land that he already had. So eventually the farm grew to 320 acres. And near the beginning of the Civil War, Moses sold a piece of the land for use to the Poor farm, and it was on this property that the cemetery at the Poor farm was established. So there's the Poor farm, or there's the cemetery. And this is an 1893 map, so about this time, 1890 perhaps, right around there, the little log cabin that was 1.5 story was replaced by a new house, a modified 4 square. So this is the new house, and that's the old house. And as you can see, Moses also chose his land well because he had a spring right there, which to us would be a huge inconvenience, but for in those days, they'd walk 4 or 5 miles just to get the daily water, so it wasn't a big deal. Did you do that, Laurel? Do you remember doing that? No? Well, you live by a river, what am I saying? So, this is from 1875, and it shows what the farm would have actually looked like as far as timber and so on at that time. So this is where we are. There's the house. And this represents timber and woods. So it gives you a good, that's a schoolhouse, in case you're wondering. It's not a residence. At some point, possibly in late 1859, when his wife Mercy died on November 7th, Moses established a small family cemetery about 50 feet south of his home. That would be the old home, or the cabin, not the new house. And this is an overhead showing the approximate area of where that would be. That's the driveway into the farm. The houses would have been right in here, and the cemetery would have been right in here. Is that right, Jim? Have I got that right? He's nodding yes. I think he doesn't want me to talk to him, that's what I think. And then this would be the county home and the insane asylum and the cemetery. The grave registration card from 1929, which the state of Iowa commissioned the American Legion to go through and record all of the graves of the veterans that they could discern in the county. So in 1929, this card says L.L. Littlefield is the name of the patent, or where the parents. Littlefield headstone in Andrews Cemetery. This has a soldier's name inscribed on it, and where it says the direction of the entrance is southwest of the Littlefield house. So in 1929, before the new house was built, the cemetery was recorded as being southwest of the Littlefield house, which I was told by someone who does not want to be talked to that that was in an orchard. And there's kind of, I mean, I think I've got this right. This is a well, if I read it right. So this is where the farmstead would have been, and then the cemetery would have been out here someplace, if I've got that figured right. You can just nod, you don't have to talk. So, it's not exactly known who was all buried there. I was told that there was, a person remembered 12 to 15 graves in this cemetery, and that the whole area of the cemetery was about 100 square feet. We don't know who exactly was buried there, but we can discern that all these people were buried there. And there might have been, you know, a couple of babies or whatever, but these people were probably buried there. And so Moses died February 3rd, 1878 on his farm. He was buried in the small family cemetery there. Now, you would think that this would be the end of Moses' story, right? Nope. After Moses' death, the farm and cemetery passed down through succeeding generations of the Littlefield family, including his son Samuel W. and grandsons Samuel M., Dr. Samuel M., and L.L. Laurie Littlefield. All were quite prominent during their lifetimes. The last descendant bearing the Littlefield surname was Laurie's son, Glenn, and that was Jim's uncle. As the story was told to me, Glenn, being about 40 years old, never having been married, never going to be married, with no children, and possibly fearing for the safety and security of the burials, decided to have them moved to the Andrews Cemetery. So you've got the Littlefield big monument, and then each one of these stones marks a burial. So that was about 1960, and following the guidelines for legally moving a burial were followed, and then the grave markers, I'm told, were pulled up as well and moved with the burials. And it is thought that Moses' large gravestone, for some reason, was not installed at the Andrews Cemetery. Part of the reason, I think, probably was because his name was already inscribed on the big tombstone, and he does have one of these smaller tombstones. So I think they just, you know, don't need 3 tombstones for one burial, I guess. But 2 big questions remain. Why was it taken to Indianola, and how did it get there? According to family, no family members ever lived in Indianola, nor even in that direction. We will probably never know the answers, but we are glad that it found its way back home again. The marker will be erected at a later date in the Littlefield family plot at Andrew, taking its rightful place with the other family gravestones. And there are so many people to thank for their help in retrieving this marker. So, the Jackson County Historical Society, Bonnie Mitchell, Jackson County Pioneer Cemetery Commission, Elaine Edwards, Jackson County Genealogical Chapter, Steve Till, of the Andrews Cemetery, Jackson County Board of Supervisors, and Jim and Bob Breeden. And that doesn't even count our major players. And see, there's that handsome guy that's in the back again. But if this young couple had not taken it upon themselves to take responsibility for this tombstone, it would have been lost to history. My print is too small, that's why I'm looking. Okay, this is early Iowa. This is what the state or territory of Iowa looked like in 1839. And the only thing we can see over here is Bellevue and Charleston, which would be Bellevue and Sebula today. And it's just a reminder to us of the saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Of course, this is not the first time that I've had to deal with an eloped tombstone from Jackson County. In 2005, I was involved in another case of another wayward gravestone. And Jim was there too. He was one of the major helpers. And he's right there. The big white blob in the middle of the picture is me. And this gravestone in the middle there was returned from Fort Wayne, Indiana, where it had gone some 20 years earlier, some 330 miles away. And the Pioneer Cemetery Commission restored it to its original cemetery. This was in Old Van Buren, which is 4 miles north of Preston. There was no plat, so we just put it where we found a good place. And hopefully Mr. Carpenter's happy with that. Samuel D. Carpenter is another historically significant figure from Jackson County, described as a man of having sterling character. He was a pioneer of Van Buren Township, and in 1815, at the age of 23, he married Frances Krevling. He was 21, she was 15, and no, that's not a bad thing. Together they had 8 children. Now Samuel was a kind of Renaissance man. He moved around a lot, he tried many different things and many different jobs during his lifetime. In 1824, he was employed by the Hudson's Bay Fur Company and trapped furs for them. He and his family eventually moved to Galena, Illinois in 1827, and in 1828 he opened the Mansion House Inn there, and was also engaged in the smelting of lead. And he had his own coal mine, and many other enterprises came after that. Samuel joined the 27th Volunteer Regiment of the Illinois Militia as part of the Black Hawk War, and in 1838, his daughter, Lucinda, was married to Philip Burr Bradley. As you can tell by the picture, he's not somebody you would want to invite to a party. If you want to have a party, invite Bonnie. They were married at Galena, and that's how Samuel became acquainted with Ansel Briggs. Later he bought a farm in Van Buren Township about 1839, and after his neighbors Dennis Collins and Bart Corwin had run-ins with the Brown Gang of Bellevue, he became a member of what was known as the Bellevue Mob, organized by Colonel Thomas Cox, who you saw earlier, which included citizens from all over the eastern part of the county. Now, the mob worked to rid the county of the band of outlaws. There's some controversy whether they were outlaws or whether they were good people who just got a bad rap. Probably never know for sure. But that work to get rid of the mob culminated in the Bellevue War. And this is a representation of the Bellevue War painted by the third great-nephew of Henderson Palmer, who was the first casualty of the Bellevue War. And this resides at the Bellevue Public Library. Now, Samuel did not actually take part in the war itself, and the reason that is because he didn't find out about it until afterwards. I'm sure today he would have been tweeted or something about it, but back then it was a little more difficult. During the final years of his life, he suffered large financial reversals, which weighed heavily on him and his family. Samuel Carpenter died December 21st of 1845 at the age of 51 years old. And his greatest claim to fame here is that he was, now get your scorecards out, he was the first husband of Ansel Briggs' second wife. And another gravestone marker, which moved but not quite as far, is that of William Vaughn. And in case you can't see it, it's right there, back in the bush. And this picture was from 2013 when I first became aware of this situation. And I wondered at the time how the memorial stone, he has a private stone and a military stone of a veteran killed because of a war, not in a war, but from wounds that he got as a war, could have gotten into such a place of dishonor. And I was also got to wondering about the life of William Vaughn, who came to Jackson County early in the fall of 1838 with his parents and one sibling. They crossed the Mississippi River near Bellevue, coming from the lead mines near Galena, Illinois. And they stopped for a few days at Bellevue at a hotel known in those days as, anybody want to guess?
Bellevue Hotel.
Brown's Hotel. Mr. Vaughn Sr., who spent a few days in search of a suitable location for his family, and he finally located one near the vicinity of what is known as Dark Hollow. And that's, so again, just for reference, this is Bridgeport. That's the Vaughn property. So it's only, I mean, it looks like a long way, but it's only about a mile, mile and a half, the way the crow flies. Excuse me. Mr. Vaughn, it appears, also chose his land well, as it had water running right through it, and it was well timbered as well. Here they experienced the hardships of the early pioneers: an axe, a grub hoe, a plow, and so this is in 1836. This is from Colonel Cox's survey, and it was right up here. And down here was where Bellevue, Bridgeport. And if you can see it, Maquoketa River. M-A-C-O-Q-U-T-A. And you thought it was hard to spell today. So they had all these tools, and of course, one thing they really needed was a yoke of oxen. um, and the oxen answered all the requirements of beasts of burden. They were used for travel, they were used for farming, they were used for pulling, teamster work like that. Another thing that was indispensable was a rifle, and it served a double purpose. It supplied the family with meat, which was the principal article of the diet at that time here, and also of defense. So here in 1838, there were deer, wild turkeys, prairie chickens, to say nothing of the smaller game such as squirrels, rabbits, etc. And all of those at that time were found here in abundance. There were also a large number of timber wolves and black panthers, wildcats, lynxes, and other deadly enemies of the early settlers. Mink, red muskrat, otter, swifts, and now and then a fox were among the more docile animals that supplied the hunter and trapper with furs. So living in much the same way as the Littlefield family was about 7 miles to the north of them. Andrew and Bellevue were the only trading posts that first winter. Bellevue was the county seat. Now, if you couldn't get what you needed in Andrew or Bellevue, you had to cross the river and go to Galena. And that was not as easy then as it is today. The first winter of Mr. Vaughn's residence in Jackson County was a trying one. Breadstuff had to be procured, and an occasional trip to the neighbors on business or hunting expeditions called him away, sometimes all night or into the late of the next night. And this left Mrs. Vaughn with her 2 young children all alone. Upon one of these occasions, Mrs. Vaughn heard a cry that she took for the crying of someone who was in distress. Thinking that it was her husband returning, she went to the door and answered it. And she was nearly paralyzed with fright when one of the most blood-curdling screams came from nearby. She barred up the door, gathered her 2 sleeping children about her, and awaited for developments. It proved to be a large panther like the one you just saw. It came and leaped upon the clapboard roof of the cabin and started clawing through it to get to the inhabitants inside. As good luck would have it, Mr. Vaughn returned right then, and upon nearing the cabin, he fired his gun, which he always carried, as a signal of his return. It scared the panther, and he disappeared into the woods. In later years, in relating this incident, she reported that the gun was the sweetest music she had ever heard. And there were many more incidents incurred that tried the nerves of these early pioneers. William Vaughn Sr. died January 16, 1854 at the age of 54. His death caused by wounds incurred during the Bellevue War, in which he participated in April of 1841. He received a wound which made him an invalid, and it took him several years to die from that wound. Meanwhile, and then when he did die, he was probably either buried on his farm or in the Braden Cemetery. We call it Braden, even though some experts have said that Braden is an abbreviation of Breeden, so this may be another family burying ground. I don't know. This predates the current Bridgeport Cemetery by at least a decade. So the oldest burials that were put into a cemetery or a burying ground were put here if they weren't buried on their property. So when the WPA went through, the Works Project Administration went through in 1941, they recorded all the information on all the tombstones they could find and read. William Vaughn Sr. stone was listed, no location given. So we don't know where it was, for sure. William Vaughn Jr., or as we call him, William Vaughn the Soldier, was a resident of Fulton, Illinois when he mustered in Company G, 13th Illinois Infantry on May 24th of 1861. He was described at that time as being 21 years of age, 5'9", brown hair with hazel eyes and dark complexion. He was a single farmer. He was discharged August 11th, 1863 due to disability. Now, he may have been wounded in the advance or siege of Jackson, or in the Battle of Brandon, both of which took place in July of that year. And these were the last two actions that happened to Company G before William Vaughn's disability discharge. On May 11th, 2023, the Jackson County Pioneer Cemetery Commission finally rescued William Vaughn's grave markers from their brushy location. And this is a couple of our volunteers, our president, George Doherty, and Dave Kuhn. And with our volunteers, we had about 7 that day. And we re-erected the stones. We have a plat that shows where he was supposed to be in the cemetery, and we discerned where that location was, and then we put them back as close to that location as we could get it, and re-erected them in the rightful place. And that's the front of the private stone, and then we put, the private stone was actually broken into 3 pieces. It had been repaired several times. So when we re-erected the stones, we put the military stone back to back to give the other one support. So hopefully it will last longer. There is a cap of cement at the bottom under the stone, but we didn't pour an entire base. Hopefully now, William Vaughn, Samuel D. Carpenter, and Moses Littlefield can rest more peacefully now that their gravestones have been reclaimed. Thank you to all who helped. Anybody have any questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. You're welcome to come up and examine the tombstone. If you want to, just remember, don't talk to Jim. Yeah.
The idea of Black Panther struck me. So you say the current large cat population is ancestors of that panther, or where did that panther originate?
There were a number of panthers here. There were a lot of panthers here. There are a number of stories of settlers being attacked or encountering black panthers. Yeah.